Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the New York Symposium with Diane Sare. I'm Diane Sare, and today is the 5th of July. Sorry, I'm just laughing because the dog is photobombing me. And Chris, don't start screen sharing, please. Oh, it's distracting. At any rate, okay, good. Basically, we are in really an amazing political situation right now, one of extreme uncertainty. We have a president in the White House who is undeniably senile. This was considered deniable before the debate. I'm not really sure why, because it was obvious to anyone who saw President Biden anywhere that he was suffering from various frailties, including mental frailties, and that's been going on for months, frankly, years. But after the debate, it became undeniable. Biden and Jill Biden seem to be clinging to power. The Democratic Party seems to be eager to dump them. It's really not clear who will be his replacement. And this is at a time when we are lurching closer to thermonuclear war because this administration, which clearly is not being run by Joe Biden, has a bunch of people in it who are delusionally arrogant and think that they can continue to provoke Russia to launch strikes into Russian territory, to kill civilians, to target military installations, and that Russia is not going to respond. This is obviously extremely dangerous. We also have the ongoing genocide in Gaza perpetuated by Bibi Netanyahu and the IDF. The IDF has now signaled twice that it's time to end this, first with their spokesperson, Daniel Hagari, who said that you simply cannot beat Hamas, that it's an ideology. This is not a winning war. Now, apparently, they're saying that they're running out of ammunition. Netanyahu wants to open up another front against Hezbollah. The guy clearly has a sort of Hitler in the bunker mentality, maybe because they do think in a very similar way in terms of degrading human beings as to being less than human and thereby attempting to justify mass killing of innocent people. Now, this is also not helping the United States. I read earlier today that apparently last year was the greatest single year drop in farm income ever in American history. I don't know how people expect to eat if our farmers are going out of business, and we are having serious problems with our electric power supply, with water management, with flooding, with inflation, which is hitting Americans very hard. And we run into this because we're out on the street all the time talking to people who are telling us they can't afford to buy meat. They can't afford to feed their family. They can't afford to pay rent. They're choosing between paying rent and paying for something else urgent, having health insurance or auto insurance or any number of other things. So it's really a perfect storm in that regard, which is what you would expect in the moment that Lyndon LaRouche warned when the Berlin Wall came down, and he and his wife Helga said, yes, the collapse of the communist system is a big deal, but it is nothing. It will be seen as nothing compared to when the bankrupt transatlantic liberal free trade system collapses. That's what we're in. So in such a time, it is very urgent to remember the principles of the American Revolution, to inform ourselves, inform our compatriots in our nation what our nation actually should be doing. We're not going to get out of this mess by having a laundry list of every single thing that is wrong, because virtually everything is wrong, and you won't solve it that way. You have to think in terms of principle. That's what President Putin did in his June 14th address to the foreign ministry, where he laid out a peace proposal for Ukraine, but not between Russia and Ukraine in isolation, but in the context of a new Eurasian security architecture. So from that standpoint, I chose to dig up the speech or pamphlet written by John Quincy Adams for the 4th of July, 1821, 45 years after the original Declaration of Independence, and to take some short quotes from that to put into a leaflet, particularly the question of what has America given to the world? And Adams' response, paraphrased by me, is that America has demonstrated the inextinguishable rights of man, in a sense, as the only legitimate foundation of government. And he went on to say that in 45 years, we have not invaded a single other nation. We have respected the sovereignty and right to self-determination of other nations, and America seeks not abroad for monsters to destroy. People know this. Later in that speech, he also says that if America were to become entangled in conflicts in other nations, no matter how much certain causes may resonate with our own principles, that while we might become the dictatress of the world, we would no longer rule our own spirit. Well, that's where we are. And we're not the dictatress of the world, because 2/3 of the world isn't listening to us anymore. But that is what makes us all the more desperate, and this war threat all the more pronounced. So what I'd like to do is ask Dave to just show you, because for the 4th of July here in New York, now that we're on the ballot, is some of our activities. And oh, actually, before I get to that, I want to share with you, let me do this first, my friend and fellow LaRouche candidate, Jose Vega, who is running for Congress in the 15th CD in the Bronx, did a very effective, he and 4 other of his volunteer staffers, very effective intervention against Matt Pottinger, who's a former national security advisor to Donald Trump, a raving anti-China lunatic, and who was speaking at the Asia Society. Now I'm trying to, good, because my thing is not working. So please show the Jose Vega clip as covered by RT, which interviewed him shortly after.
Story here on RT International, where activist Jose Vega confronted U.S. political hawk Matthew Pottinger, known for his anti-China stance, but it all happened on stage during an event at the Asia Society of New York. And Mr. Vega was essentially dragged away and ended up being choked by security.
And like you are trying to tell me China is the actual responsible one for World War III? I'm supposed to believe China is surveilling our kids? We have a mass surveillance state here. It's called fascism, okay? The NSA spies on everything we do. This incoherent up on the stage is no different than the incoherent babbler named Biden, who probably isn't running our government. We don't need to have World War III. We can actually work with China. Did you know that? We can work with China. Every time they come, they offer a peaceful solution. Listen, don't start World War III. Please.
We had a chance to speak with that man, Mr. Jose Vega, and he had a lot of things to say. He basically summed it up with saying that the collective West pushes a confrontational policy on the world stage. Have a listen for yourself.
Matt Pottinger, who is a State Department spook, as I like to say, and is now also advising people on the subcommittee for strategic competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party, was hosting a book talk because he just released a book called The Boiling Moat. And the entire talk was just filled with hawkish points about why we should continue to be antagonistic towards the Chinese and the Russians. The room wasn't so big, and I was able to get my message across. And I did expect tension. I did expect confrontation. I knew they weren't going to be happy with me, but I certainly didn't expect the moderator himself get off stage and come towards me. The West, as we like to call it, doesn't want peace in the world. We know that Boris Johnson has sabotaged the peace talks that happened in April of 2022 that could have stopped the war in Ukraine. We know that NATO has no intention of stopping any of the three front world wars, whether it's Israel, whether it's Taiwan, or whether it's Ukraine. They want these wars to continue. And anybody who presents any kind of alternative or a threat to that and starts talking about peace is going to be silent, or in my case, choked out of the room. They want to criticize, China or Russia for being authoritarian, but I live in the United States, which, has free speech, supposedly, and that's how we get treated for using our First Amendment rights. But I believe in the American people. That's why I'm running for Congress. I believe that the American people, if they are presented with the right, not just information, but the right truth, that we can work with the Chinese and the Russians, and that we can actually cooperate and not have this antagonistic role. I genuinely believe we can make something happen where people decide, let's stop war and let's work together. People need to actually stand up and wake up and say, wait a minute, my country isn't even being run by the person I thought was running it. So in order for there to be a change, we should figure out who's actually running our country and our government first, and then dictate from there what the people want their foreign policy to be, which should be cooperation and peace for all.
Great. Thank you. So while Jose's intervention was going viral all over the world, volunteers with Sare for Senate were deploying across the state to get out my 4th of July statement. And I have a couple of clips of that. We can show our dear friend Art and his wife were at the largest parade in the state in Manlius, not far from Syracuse, New York, and then we're out today again. So Dave, if you have that.
Hi, this is Art Murphy with the Diane Sare for Senate campaign. I'm here with my wife Madeline in the little town of Homer, New York, about 20 miles south of Syracuse. And we're getting a lot of interested responses to our campaign to get a pro-peace independent elected, although some people think we're exaggerating the problem. However, yesterday we were out in Manlius, New York, getting out Diane's 4th of July message. We got about over 500 copies of this flyer out to all the people on the parade route, as well as a lot of her palm cards. There was even a couple of people who remembered signing her petition before. But there were some very interesting people in the parade, aside from the bagpipe bands and the marching bands, who all really appreciated the fact that Diane's a musician and took her literature. There's also a fellow who was reciting by memory the entire Declaration of Independence. He was dressed in colonial garb and reciting it over a loudspeaker as he marched along. So it's quite an interesting affair, and I think we're going to get Diane some big support in central New York.
Great, thanks. And then last, we had a team at the famous Coney Island hot dog eating contest. And there we got out several hundred copies of the statement, and we can just show a short clip, maybe Dave, around a minute or so, of me on my famous bullhorn, the best investment of my campaign so far. This 4th of July, welcome, and July, thank you. This 4th of July, it is time to defeat the British Empire for once and for all. It is time to end the perpetual war and fascism that our government is supporting all over the world, while they crush the American people and loot our economy. I'm Diane Sare. I am an independent candidate for U.S. Senate, and I am actually for peace, not peace in one place and war somewhere else, not peace abroad and war on the American people, and not war abroad and war on the American people, which is what we have right now. I'm running. Great, thank you very much. So that is the intro to the presentation tonight, which features my two campaign historians, my husband, Chris Sare, which from the looks of the video I'm seeing here is going to go first, and then Robert Wesser. So Chris, so glad to have you. It's been at least a half an hour since I last saw you. Please go ahead.
Glad to be here. Actually, Bob and I are going to do this somewhat together. I will make the somewhat formal presentation, and Bob will be free to chime in wherever he has something important to add. I'm going to start my screen share here. All right, so what I want to try to get across tonight is that the American Revolution was and all great American patriots understood this to be the case, whether it was Benjamin Franklin, whether it was John Quincy Adams, whether it was Abraham Lincoln, FDR, JFK, and most emphatically the American patriot, and the reason why we're here right now organizing, Lyndon LaRouche. And I mean, I will just say that like Benjamin Franklin, Lyndon LaRouche dedicated his entire life to the idea of furthering the principles of the American Revolution, and to spread those principles throughout the world, such that actually right now those principles are being advanced, fortunately or unfortunately, outside of the United States far more than they're being advanced by the United States. But we intend to change that, obviously. And I think the critical point about history and Americans knowing their history is that we've got to bring back the American Republic that we love and that we intend to save, and that will be critical, because if we don't bring back that American Republic, unfortunately, this American empire, if you will, because we've lost our way, we've become more like an empire than a republic. Unfortunately, we have the potential to blow up everything. So I want to go to to this first slide here. This is Nicholas of Cusa. It would be remiss to start any discussion of the United States without bringing up Nicholas of Cusa. Helga Zepp LaRouche, Lyndon LaRouche's wife, did tremendous work on this philosopher and scientist, Nicholas of Cusa, from the period of the Renaissance. And I'm going to show you something shocking here. It may be shocking to you. It was certainly shocking to me when I first read it. Compare what he says in 1434 to what our beloved Declaration of Independence in 1776 says. Hence, since natural law is based on reason, all law is rooted by nature in the reason of man. For since all are by nature free, every governance, whether it consists in a written law or in a living law in the person of a prince, can only come from the agreement and consent of the subjects. For if men are by nature equal in power and equally free, the true, properly ordered authority of one common ruler, who is their equal in power, can only be constituted by the election and consent of the others. And law is also established by consent. 1434. Now, in 1434, Cusa was not able to establish this principle that he wrote in a government in Europe. But the idea, which is powerful, because ideas are powerful, ideas are the most powerful thing in the universe. And this powerful idea would become embodied 350 years later, 340 years later, in the United States Republic, in the Declaration of Independence. Now, I'll go to Gottfried Leibniz, who, like Cusa, was another universal genius. LaRouche studied Leibniz from the age of 12. He studied his philosophy. Now, Leibniz was a philosopher, an economist, a nation builder, and also had powerful ideas and wanted to spread his ideas and see where his ideas could stick for the advancement of mankind. And he said, he wasn't in a republic. He didn't live in a republic. So he said, I'm not a creature of the nation that I'm from. I'm a universal mind. I am for all of mankind. And I am trying to get these ideas to find root where I can. So he wrote this on the establishment of a society in Germany for the promotion of the arts and sciences, and he was establishing scientific institutions, philosophical and scientific institutions wherever he could. Now, so his idea in this to expand and improve sciences, to preserve useful ideas, inventions, and experiments, to improve schools. I have to just move this down. Sorry. To improve schools, to educate the youth, not only in poetry, logic, and scholastic philosophy, but also in history, mathematics, geography, physics, morals, and civil affairs. To set up museums of arts and rarities, to improve manufactures, machines and clockworks, waterworks, shipping, painting and all figurative arts, textile mills, glass blowing and forming, dyeing factories, medicinal arts, steel and other metallurgical production, chemistry. And importantly, to improve trade. Never let raw materials leave our country unprocessed. Set up a secure bank for investors to invest their monies. Now, these are wise ideas for any nation, any nation. And when you think about the creation of the United States, this idea was definitely followed by the most patriotic factions in the United States, including Benjamin Franklin, the fight for sciences, Hamilton, Nicholas Biddle with the Second National Bank, Hamilton with the First National Bank, setting up a secure bank for investors to invest their monies. Never let raw materials leave the country unprocessed. What Hamilton talks about in the Society for Useful Manufactures. This is how you build a nation. But again, Leibniz was in oligarchical Europe. It was just at the end of he was born just at the end of the 30 Years' War, and Europe was still an oligarchical cesspool, and his ideas could not get taken up by a nation. Now, what he did was he went to Peter the Great of Russia. And I would ask you to think about what I'm going to go through tonight in terms of Russia and in terms of Russia's role in the history of the United States, a role that most Americans don't know. And there's much more to it than what I'll talk about tonight, but I want you to think about this because the United States and Russia share a rich history, and we're intertwined in very, very critical periods, which is a story in and of itself, but it'll be touched upon tonight. Now, what Leibniz says to Peter the Great, he's organizing Peter the Great. He's a philosopher. He has only ideas. He has no power. He's not a king. He's not a prince. He's a philosopher with ideas, like Lyndon LaRouche, like Ben Franklin. And he says to Peter, well, I'm proposing to you to adopt this project that I'm laying out. He says China and Europe, as the two most extreme ends of the world, would be brought together through the mediation of the Tsar. By this means, Chinese products and news from China would come to Europe, and on the other hand, the Christian faith would spread to China, indeed through Moscow as mediator. The prerequisite for this would be that we bring to Moscow all the institutions we have in Europe. Your Majesty could attach China and Europe with one another. It's a very bold idea. And he says, in another quote, he says, I have these ideas. All I need is a prince to take up these ideas. Well, that was Peter the Great. And what came out of this was in 1725, the creation of the Russian Academy of Sciences. So this was the idea of building institutions to promote scientific progress, technological progress, knowledge for the development of mankind. All right, now, our Leibniz, Benjamin Franklin, spent his entire life, like LaRouche, like Leibniz, spent his entire life in the service of what would become the United States Republic. Most people do not think of themselves as responsible to spend their entire lives in the service of a republic, of a nation, much less of mankind, of many republics, of many nations. But Ben Franklin was a tremendous organizer, an absolutely amazing organizer. And before we got to the American Revolution, we've talked about this. There's other presentations that we've done, but Ben Franklin was hopeful that we could avoid the revolution in the 1760s, late 1750s, 1760s. He was still hoping that England could be organized to become a republic. And he was working with people in England like Bolton, Matthew Bolton, James Watt, people who were scientists, Brindley, who built canals in England. He was working with these people in Manchester and other places to develop the nation of England and hopefully create a republic there. And that would make a revolution unnecessary because it would no longer be an empire trying to control the United States colonies. It didn't work, unfortunately, or fortunately, but Franklin tried that. He was thinking in terms of organizing a way out of this disastrous situation of the colonies being harassed and attacked by the British Empire. So Franklin, he is the American Leibniz. He sets up the American Philosophical Society in the United States. He sets up public libraries. He sets up fire departments. He sets up all the things that you could think of that are necessary for the general welfare of a nation. That's what Ben Franklin does. He then is the key, and his models that he follows: Cotton Mather, John Winthrop Jr., James Logan. Logan had the writings of Leibniz in his library in Philadelphia, where Ben Franklin moved from Massachusetts down to Philadelphia as a young man, and was surrounded, imbibed these ideas from people who were his wise elders. Now this is the Committee of Five. Ben Franklin there on the far right of those five. This is the Declaration of Independence being presented to the Constitutional Congress, and so Ben Franklin essentially delivers on what Nicholas of Cusa is trying to organize 340 years later. Ben Franklin is the architect of the Declaration of Independence. Yes, Thomas Jefferson wrote it, but Franklin was the architect of the most profound ideas in there. Now I want to get to the point about the American Revolution, which is now underway with this Declaration of Independence. There's a fight that goes on around the world in Europe. Now, King George III, who we are waging a revolution against, he says to Catherine the Great of Russia, he says, "I accept the assistance of a certain part of your troops as you have proposed, which might regrettably be rendered necessary as a consequence of acts of rebellion by my subjects in certain of my colonies in America." Because he thinks he's got a deal with Catherine II, Catherine the Great, that they're going to send Russian troops over there. Catherine responds to George, "I am only just starting to enjoy the peace, and your majesty will know that my empire needs repose." This was after the war that established Russia in Crimea, and that kicked the Turks out of Crimea. And so she says, "You will also know in what condition the army is emerging, albeit victoriously, from a long and bitter war and a punishing climate. I have to confess to you, first of all, that the period from the present time to the spring is too short even to give my troops a chance to recuperate from the labors they have performed and for measures to be taken to reorganize them properly. Also, without dwelling on the inconveniences that would arise if such a substantial corps were to be deployed in another hemisphere, where it would find itself under an authority with which it was almost completely unfamiliar, and where it would be almost totally deprived of contact with its monarch, my own belief in peace, which has cost me such efforts, positively forbids me to deprive myself of a significant part of my troops at such short notice. So, sorry, George, we're not sending any troops on behalf of the British Empire. Good luck." Now, meanwhile, I'm not going to say that she is a supporter of the American Revolution. She's a monarch. She is Elizabeth the Great of Russia. She's not exactly interested in a revolution that would spread to Russia. But there are people around her, like Golitsyn, who is an ambassador to the Netherlands from Russia. And he is in an interesting dialogue with Ben Franklin about science, about electricity. Where's Ben Franklin? Ben Franklin, after writing the Declaration of Independence and submitting it, he goes to France. He is then in France, and we'll get more into this. He's in France organizing everything that he can to back up the American Revolution in Europe. So just to give you a sense of this, Golitsyn, who is an ambassador from Russia to the Netherlands, he is in a dialogue with this revolutionary upstart, Benjamin Franklin. He says, "I dare to flatter myself, sir, that you will not disapprove of the liberty I take to write to you. without having in any way the advantage of being known to you. Think of the respect that this ambassador from Russia has for this American scientist, Ben Franklin, to say in such a way. I thought I could allow, as one of your most sincere admirers, I thought I could allow myself this approach, that of loving the sciences and of truly taking an interest in their progress, even gives me the right to address myself to you. Who better than you, sir, could decide if the ideas that I have formed of positive and negative electricities and of the attractive power of the points are correct or not? Now, there's similar discussions going on with Aquinas, who is a advisor to the Tsarina, and also he's educating her children. So there's Ben Franklin. He's in France, and he is basically a spy for the American Revolution. There's all kinds of stories, of course, about Ben Franklin. He's a womanizer. He's this and that. He is on a mission to secure the victory of the U.S. Republic over the British Empire. That is what he is in France to do, period. And you can say whatever else about what he might have been involved in. It's really nonsense, and it really doesn't matter. This guy is committed to the creation of the American Republic, and he is a genius. He is brilliant in what he does. So he is, while he's in France, just to give you a small taste of what he organizes, all of these people from around Europe who are freedom fighters, Kazimir Pulaski, who was fighting the Russians in Poland. He was fighting for the freedom of Poland. He said, I came here where freedom is being defended to serve it and to live or die for it. He submits himself to Franklin. Franklin organizes, he writes a letter to George Washington, organizing Pulaski's permission to go to America. Franklin advised General Washington that Pulaski was famed for his bravery in defense of the liberty of his country and that he may be highly useful to our service. Pulaski arrived in Boston in July of 1777. Then Michael Kovács from Hungary submits his desire to come to the United States to Franklin, and Franklin organizes it. And he says, I will be most faithful unto death. He goes over, he joins Pulaski, and they create the cavalry unit, and both of them lose their lives in 1779 in the Battle of Savannah within 2 days of each other. They both, Pulaski is shot and he dies 2 days later. Kovács is killed right on the scene of the battle. Major General von Steuben, who wrote the regulations for the order and discipline of troops of the United States, and who was critical in training the troops with George Washington at Valley Forge, also came through Benjamin Franklin and left France to go to the United States and give his services to the American Republic. Lafayette, General Lafayette. This is the first meeting of Washington and Lafayette, August 3rd, 1777. Lafayette comes through Ben Franklin as well and comes to the United States. So this is what Franklin's organizing. Now, here's a breakthrough that we get, because what Franklin is there to do is not just organize Europeans to come over and fight. Franklin is trying to get France to come in on the side of the United States, of the Americans in the Revolution. And what happens is the key battle, the key victory in Saratoga, October 17, 1777, this is Burgoyne's surrender. You can see Burgoyne there surrendering to General Bob
Horatio Gates.
Horatio Gates, right, General Gates. And Tadeusz Kosciuszko, another European who came in through Ben Franklin, who's an engineer. Bob, why don't you come in on the importance of this gentleman?
Yeah, well, it's funny. It's a funny story because he heard about the revolution. He came over to Philadelphia in '76, I think. He met Franklin. He was trained in the Vauban School of Fortifications in France. So he said to Franklin, "I'm here to offer my services. You know, but I'll if you have an exam for civil engineers and military engineers, I'll take it, and you can see if I pass." And Franklin goes, "I'm sorry, we have no one to proctor that. You're hired." And it was his brilliant, absolutely brilliant engineering at Saratoga, which actually laid the trap for the Americans to trap the British there with his fortifications there. So it was absolutely critical.
It sounds like, I mean, since he studied in France and later on, with West Point, and we'll talk more about this later, but this idea of a corps of engineers was so critical in the founding of the United States, not only securing the American Revolution, but then later on, the nation building that will occur, that will be fought for, and the whole idea of internal improvements. So now, meanwhile, I just want to give you a sense of this. These are Musin Pushkin, the Russian envoy to Great Britain, Ivan Osterman, ambassador to France. I don't want to go through quotes here so much, but I mean, basically, Ivan Osterman is the ambassador to France while Ben Franklin is there, and there's all of these. He writes back to Panin, who is the sort of chief foreign policy advisor to Catherine II, and the head of the College of Foreign Affairs. He writes to Panin in letters back and forth talking about Ben Franklin's activities in France, not in a hostile way. So they're very interested in what the Americans are doing. For one thing, they do see the British as a potential foe, as a potential foe to Russia, controlling the trade, everything we know about the British Empire, trade choke points, trying to keep other countries down, divide and conquer, balance of power. I mean, so they're not exactly in love with the British. At the same time, they don't, Catherine II, like we said, doesn't necessarily want to see a revolution overthrowing monarchs. But the people around her seem to be quite pro-American if you look at the letters that they're writing, and they're following this very, very closely and very interestedly. So now George Washington, he takes note of this in what's going on in Russia, and he writes to Marquis de Lafayette, who's now, of course, in the United States. He writes to him, "We are not a little pleased to find from good authority that the solicitations and offers of the court of Great Britain to the Empress of Russia have been rejected with disdain." 2 days prior to that, he writes to George Clinton, the governor of New York at the time, quote, that the city of Amsterdam has prepared a form of a treaty with America. And remember, Golitsyn is the Russian ambassador to the Netherlands as well. Just keep that in mind. So he says that the city of Amsterdam has prepared a form of a treaty with America to be proposed to the States General, that the Empress of Russia has positively refused to enter into subsidiary treaty with Great Britain, and has motivated her refusal in terms of breathing a generous regard to the rights of mankind. That's George Washington's assessment of what's going on in Russia. That's very interesting. Now, Golitsyn and Aquinas, Ben Franklin's two closest allies and followers, who he is in a direct correspondence, and there are some surviving letters I would imagine that there are more than those letters. I think a lot of letters get destroyed in the process of this kind of, diplomatic situation. But nonetheless, these two gentlemen, and specifically Aquinas, writes the Treaty of Armed Neutrality that Catherine II makes law for Russia. And what the Treaty of Armed Neutrality says is she, Catherine, finds these principles registered in the law, in the natural law of peoples, which every nation is justified to demand for itself, and which the belligerent powers cannot ignore without violating the laws of neutrality and without disavowing the rules which they themselves have adopted in diverse treaties and public commitments. Number one, that neutral vessels may navigate freely from one port to another and along the coasts of nations at war. Number two, that the effects belonging to the subjects of the belligerent powers may pass inviolably on neutral ships, with the exception of contraband merchandise. Number three, that the Empress, as to the specifications of the above-mentioned merchandise, adheres to what is stipulated in Articles 10 and 11 of her Treaty of Commerce with Great Britain, extending these obligations to all powers at war. Number four, that in order to determine what is a blockaded port, one ought to characterize as such only those where the attacking power has stationed its vessels sufficiently near and in such a way as to render access thereto clearly dangerous. So in other words, what she's saying is that there's a freedom of navigation among nations, even in the middle of this war. And the British are basically trying to seize ships, to say that there's munitions on these ships. And of course, in some cases, at this point, there are munitions coming from France to the United States. But she's directly asserting the freedom of the waters. Now, this was not missed. The significance of this was not lost on the world. This is a Dutch cartoon. It's called The Man in the Nightshirt, or The Smothered Hubris. It shows a man in a nightshirt representing England being attacked by several men representing the countries of the Armed Neutrality League and the Allies. He is held by a Swede and a Dane. A Frenchman places a fool's cap on his head. A Dutchman places shackles around his ankles. An American runs away with his clothes. And a Russian is about to hit him with a club. In the background, a merchant fleet sails out to sea. So Franklin did it. He organized many successful operations in Europe that allowed General Washington, General Greene, other generals to win. General Lafayette. And the Battle of Yorktown is the victory of the U.S. Republic. And here's the famous picture of that with the British surrendering. Now, I want to jump 45 years ahead. Some of the very same people are now playing a different role. James Monroe was an American Revolutionary soldier. He was in the Battle of Trenton. John Quincy Adams was not. He was too young, but certainly he remembers the British occupation of Boston, and he remembers the havoc that they waged there. And of course, his father, John Adams, the second president of the United States, was very much involved in the fighting of the American Revolution. And Lafayette, the general from the American Revolution, he's now 45 years older. And James Monroe invites Lafayette to come to the United States in February of 1824. So this is a number of years after the War of 1812, the Second American Revolution, as some call it, where we defeated the British again. Now, 2 months after Monroe invites Lafayette to the United States, he signs into law the General Survey Act of 1824. This is April of 1824. And what the General Survey Act does, it establishes the principle of the federal government to be involved in the creation of internal improvements throughout the United States. And by that time, you have West Point established, and not only West Point established as a military academy, but West Point, the Army Corps of Engineers, established in West Point. What the General Survey Act does is it unleashes the power of the Army Corps of Engineers to survey the United States for places where internal improvements would be best suited. Canals, later on railroads, ports, roads, the critical internal improvements that any republic would need for the manufacturing base to prosper, for the nation to grow, for the nation to develop. That's what James Monroe does. And it's important that he does it because he comes from Virginia. He comes from the he comes from a Jeffersonian tradition, but he breaks out of it. And he, of course, Monroe, right before Madison, right before Monroe comes in, reestablishes the National Bank of the United States. In 1816, Monroe goes with this national bank, but goes even further to say, we're going to get credit out to build internal improvements in the United States. So that's what Monroe does. And I think in his Secretary of State is John Quincy Adams. And what Diane wrote in her 4th of July leaflet is really, really a beautiful leaflet, a beautiful idea, and it captures this very important mind, captures how he thought about the United States Republic, John Quincy Adams, who is a tremendously underrated Secretary of State and even more an underrated president, because people know of Adams through the Monroe Doctrine. They know that he was really the architect of the Monroe Doctrine. Of course, Monroe made it his doctrine, so it's also his. But JQA was a tremendous president, and we'll get more to this. So Lafayette accepts the offer. He comes over to the United States, and he gets a hero's welcome. This is him coming into New York City. And everywhere he goes, he's treated like an absolute hero, and it rekindles that idea of the American Revolution in the population all across the country. He visits all of the states in his two-year visit. He had just been kicked out of the government in France. In 1823, he lost his position in the government. France was going more and more towards a very, very tough monarchy. And he comes to the United States with the hope that he can also spread this Republican idea back in Europe. But he comes to the United States, and we're going to see he's on a mission. These next sections I'm going to present, they are from Bill Jones's, which you can find in EIR, Bill Jones's article, Rekindling the Spark of Liberty, Lafayette's Visit to the United States, 1824 to 1825. So he comes to New York. He then goes up to Boston. He meets John Adams, John Quincy Adams' father, John Adams, who is very elderly at this point. John Adams passes away the next year on July 4th of 1825. So he then he comes back to New York. He goes to a dinner in New York, and there's a big relief map of the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal was started in 1817. It was It's 363 miles long. He gets there in 1824. It's almost complete at that point, and he's going to go see it the next year. But this is a tremendous public works project that was funded completely by the state of New York. And DeWitt Clinton, this is a whole other story, which is the subject of another history class. That's amazing, because a lot of engineers, the not only, not the Army Corps of Engineers, but other engineers who were not part of the Army Corps were cut their teeth in their expertise in building the Erie Canal. What we talked about 2 weeks ago with the Croton Waterworks, you may remember John Bloomfield Jervis was an engineer on the Erie Canal, who then designed the water system that delivers fresh water to New York City to this day. So then Lafayette takes a trip up to West Point. He meets with Sylvanus Thayer, who's the head of West Point, who had brought all of the engineering books from France over to teach the Army Corps of Engineers the advanced knowledge of French engineering. And then he goes down to Philadelphia, which is by far the most advanced city in the country. And he says, "Here, sir, within these sacred walls, by a council of wise and devoted patriots, and in a style worthy of the deed itself, was boldly declared the independence of these vast United States, which, while it anticipated the independence, and I hope the Republican independence of the whole American hemisphere," which is, of course, what John Quincy Adams and the Monroe Doctrine is all about, the Republican independence of the whole American hemisphere, "it has begun for the civilized world the era of a new and of the only social order founded on the unalienable rights of man, the practicability and advantages of which are every day admirably demonstrated by the happiness and prosperity of your populous city, Philadelphia." Now, in Philadelphia, Lafayette was accompanied by the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. This is in August, September of 1824. Monroe has served 2 terms. He's not going to run again. The question is, who's going to become president of the United States? Who will be elected president in 1824 to continue this tradition? John Quincy Adams is running, Henry Clay is running, and a creep named Andrew Jackson is running. And so what Lafayette has on a mission here. He brings John Quincy Adams with him to Philadelphia. One of the contenders of the upcoming election, Adams' presence with the old Revolutionary War hero and the numerous toasts and speeches that Adams himself made in Lafayette's honor were dutifully reported in the local newspapers, certainly helping to secure, in the eyes of the public, Adams' credentials as a suitable successor to that departing generation of founding fathers, a fact of which the wily general, Lafayette, was quite aware. Adams then accompanies Lafayette to the nation's capital, the nation's new capital, Washington, D.C., which is just being constructed at the time. Lafayette was graciously received by President Monroe at the White House. On the following day, he is invited to the House of Representatives, and he's introduced by the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, who's also running for president. In his moving introductory speech, Clay noted, "Often we have formed the vain desire that Providence should permit the patriot to visit his country after his death, to contemplate there the changes to which time has given birth. Today, the American patriot of times past would see forests cultivated, towns founded, mountains leveled, canals opened, great roads built, great progress made in the arts, the sciences, and in the increase of population. General, your present visit to the United States is a realization of the consoling object of that wish. You are in the midst of posterity. Everywhere you must have been struck by the great challenges, the great changes, physical and moral, which have occurred since you left us. Even this city, bearing a venerated name, alike endeared to you and to us, has since emerged from the forest which then covered its site. Lafayette replied, "You have been pleased, Mr. Speaker, to allude to the peculiar felicity of my situation, when after so long an absence, I am called to witness the immense improvements, the admirable communications, the prodigious creations, of which we find an example in this city, whose name itself is a venerated palladium. In a word, all the grandeur and prosperity of those happy United States, who at the same time they notably secure the complete assertion of American independence, reflect on every part of the world the light of a far superior political civilization. What better pledge can be given of a preserving national love of liberty when these blessings are evidently the result of a virtuous resistance to oppression and institutions founded on the rights of man and the Republican principle of self-government." End of quote. The presence of Lafayette at the nation's capital also corresponded with the most critical moment of the 1824 election campaign. Although he had invitations to visit all Western states, he delayed his stay in Washington until after the elections. During the vote counting, there were many celebrations in his honor. On January 9th, at an entertainment organized in honor of Lafayette, Quincy Adams and Clay were both in attendance. And it may have been on this occasion that those two worked out the plan by which they would prevent an Andrew Jackson victory. On February 9th, 1825, the electoral votes were counted. While Jackson had received the most votes, he had not received a clear majority, and the vote was thrown for the first time into the House of Representatives. The House then proceeded to elect John Quincy Adams president, as Henry Clay, who was also a candidate, according to their previous agreement, swung his votes in favor of John Quincy Adams, putting him over the top. Adams was inaugurated on March 4th, and Henry Clay was named his Secretary of State. This combination, together with Richard Rush at the Treasury, would serve to anchor the principles of the American system firmly at the helm of state for the next 4 years. Whatever role Lafayette may have otherwise played in the election, it was clear that his tour had raised the patriotic fervor in the land that helped get John Quincy Adams elected. And I would just point out that JQA in those 4 years unleashed the most amazing amount of development that the nation had seen up to that time and long after it. I mean, I think probably only the Transcontinental Railroad of Abraham Lincoln and what FDR did with Tennessee Valley Authority, Hoover Dam, rural electrification, all that. I mean, he unleashed a massive number of canals and railroads that built the infrastructure and the agro-industrial capability of this country, not to mention observatories, science, all the scientific advancements imaginable. Just to give you a sense of the great projects that were going on that Henry Clay talks about, this is the excavation of the original Erie Canal west of Lockport, which he's about to visit. And you can see the amazing machines there that are being employed to build this great project that would transform not only New York, but the entire Great Lakes region and open up the entire interior of the United States to be developed. And this was at a time where New York City was a great trading post, a great port, an industrial center. And that's what we have to bring New York City back to being instead of what it has become. So Lafayette proceeded on his tour throughout the United States. He made his disgust with slavery known in his tour. And this is a fight that John Quincy Adams would take up his entire life. After becoming president, he then runs for U.S. Congress. And it's famous that John Quincy Adams makes the abolition of slavery his mission. Lafayette lays a cornerstone for the monument to Count Casimir Pulaski in Georgia, when he's down in Georgia. And he then goes out and visits Andrew Jackson in Tennessee, who's licking his wounds from his loss. He visits Henry Clay's home in Kentucky. And then he makes his way up to Buffalo. He goes through Ohio and the whole area. He makes his way up to Buffalo. And on June 6th, in 1825, he tours the Erie Canal. And he sees the marvel of 5 locks all in a row, which you can see here in Lockport, which was an engineering feat that had never been done before. He says Lockport and the county of Niagara contain the greatest natural and artificial wonders of the world, second only to the wonder of freedom. In his last speech on American soil, he says, I have had proudly to recognize a result of the Republican principles for which we have fought, and a glorious demonstration to the most timid and prejudiced minds of the superiority over degrading aristocracy or despotism of popular institutions founded on the plain rights of man, and where the local rights of every section are preserved under a constitutional bond of union. The cherishing of that union between the states, as it has been the farewell entreaty of our great paternal George Washington, and we will ever have the dying prayer of every American patriot, so it has become the sacred pledge of the emancipation of the world, an object in which I am happy to observe that the American people, while they give the animating example of successful free institutions, in return for an evil entailed upon them by Europe, and of which a liberal and enlightened sense is everywhere more and more generally felt, show themselves every day more anxiously interested. So I would just say in closing that unfortunately JQA only lasted 1 term, and Andrew Jackson won. He won the presidency. He did a lot of damage, but this spirit of nation building continued even during his presidency. He destroys the 1824 General Survey Act. He destroys the National Bank. This is what we're up against right now. If you want to know what Diane's campaign represents, it's that tradition of John Quincy Adams versus this British treasonous, destructive dictatorship of Andrew Jackson that tears down the nation. So Diane's campaign represents that nation building. And I think all American citizens have got to go back to studying the history because it's been robbed from us. We don't know the history of what built the nation, the national banking, the internal improvements. We don't know that. And we have to learn it quickly. And that's going to be a critical part of the campaign. So if Bob has things he wants to add in, or Diane.
Good. Could you, I guess we can be seen. It's fine. Bob, Are you there? You might want to stop screen sharing.
I'm not screen sharing, Chris.
No, Chris is.
Sorry.
I want to know if you have anything you'd like to say.
Yeah. The only thing I want to add is that, I mean, you can see from this 1824 trip of Lafayette, it took that, a hero of the revolution, to come back to rekindle. This is only 50 years after the revolution. Because patriots at that point realized that the whole country, the whole idea of the Declaration of Independence was in jeopardy. It would not last. 20 years later, less than 20 years later, a young man, protege of John Quincy Adams, named Abraham Lincoln, gave a famous speech in Illinois where he said the same thing. And I'll just read one sentence. He said the founding fathers were pillars of the temple of liberty, and now they have crumbled away. That temple must fall unless we, their descendants, supplied their places with other pillars honed from the solid quarry of sober reason. Reason must furnish all the materials of our future support and defense. So he delivers an impassioned speech that if we don't, as a generation, he's 28 years old at this point, if we don't, as a generation, revive this and give it create new statues, if you will, new works of art based on the Declaration of Independence and what Washington did, we're finished. We're absolutely finished. And he was 100% right. And that is the challenge of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. Is this generation, high school kids right now, 12-year-olds, 18-year-olds, will they take up 28-year-olds, as Lincoln was? Take that up, because if we don't do that, this nation shall perish. And the disaster for mankind, right at the point where, as Quincy Adams said, the ideas of the Declaration have begun to cover become the fabric that's covering the surface of the globe. So if we were to lose that at this point, that would be an unspeakable tragedy for mankind. And Americans, I would appeal to Americans, especially young Americans, we're not going to let that happen. And that's Diane's campaign. So.
Yeah, and I would point out that JQA is not talking about the military imposition of our freedom on the world, but that we're a beacon of liberty and we're a model that nations can follow. But this is not somehow some militaristic imposition. You know, we overthrow governments that we don't like and we put in democracy around the world, you know. It's also the 200th anniversary of Lafayette's tour, starting in August, and there will be celebrations of that starting in Staten Island, where he, you know, his first point of arrival. So it'd be a good thing for people to follow and learn.
Did you have more, Bob?
Nope.
Okay.
That's the challenge. That's the as Franklin Roosevelt said, this generation has a date with destiny. And this generation of Americans has a date with destiny. Will they follow in the footsteps of John Quincy Adams and Abraham Lincoln or not?
Exactly. And the most recent American in that tradition was Lyndon LaRouche, who absolutely was the continuation of Cusa, Leibniz, Adams, Lincoln. And that's the point of our candidacies, mine for U.S. Senate, Jose Vega and the Bronx, and what Helga is doing internationally. And I have to say, one of my favorite images from this presentation was that cartoon of that poor Brit with all the various nationalities. And we didn't include the Haitians, who also were in Savannah. I guess that will be for another time, the 500 Haitians who came and helped. So we owe the nation of Haiti a great debt, and not to pay them in the manner that Hillary Clinton has, which is criminal, but as Americans, to make sure their nation gets to be sovereign and economically developed and strong. So thank you both. For everyone listening, there's going to be a lot more. My campaign has to explode over the next months, we need people. We will soon have an order of yard signs. We need people to take yard signs, hold banners over highways, distribute literature, distribute palm cards, donate so I can produce these things. So please sign up at sareforsenate.com, and hopefully we will still be around next Friday to continue this dialogue. So thanks a lot. Good night.